The telegram sat on Muhammad Ali's hotel room desk for 3 hours before he could bring himself to open it. And when he finally tore the yellow envelope with shaking hands, the words inside confirmed what he'd been dreading since the phone call that morning. Father past 2:47 a.m. Funeral Friday. Come home. Your brother Rahman. It was February 1990, and Ali stood in a Las Vegas hotel room staring at 12 words that meant his father. Cassius Marcellus Clay Serre, the sign painter, the drinker, the man who'd named him and shaped him and complicated him in ways that would never be fully untangled, was gone, had died alone in a Louisville hospital while Ali was 1,000 miles away giving a speech at a charity event for children with disabilities. How do you mourn a man you loved and resented in equal measure, whose ghost you've been trying to outrun your entire life? Ali sat down hard on the bed, telegram still in his hand, and the Parkinson's tremor that had become constant made the paper shake like it was caught in wind. His father had been 76, had lived longer than anyone expected given the drinking and the anger and the decades of accumulated bitterness about a life that never became what he'd wanted it to be. But knowing death was coming didn't make it less devastating when it arrived, didn't ease the specific grief of realizing you'd never have another conversation with someone, never get another chance to say the things that needed saying, but always got postponed for some mythical future when the timing was better. The phone rang, his wife checking on him, having heard the news, and Ali let it ring. Couldn't bring himself to pick up and perform wellness when he felt like something fundamental had cracked inside his chest. His father had been larger than life. Filling every room, he entered with personality and charm and rage, and the idea that all that energy had just stopped, had been reduced to a body in a morgue waiting for burial, seemed impossible to process. What remains when the person who created you ceases to exist? And how much of them lives on in the body and mind they gave you? Ali's relationship with his father had been complicated from the beginning. Love layered with disappointment, pride mixed with embarrassment, gratitude fighting with resentment in a constant internal war that never resolved cleanly. Cassius Serre had been a talented artist, could paint signs and murals that brought buildings to life, had dreams of being a real artist, showing in galleries, being recognized for his talent rather than just being the black sign painter who worked cheap and drank too much. But Louisville in the 1940s and 50s didn't have space for black artists with ambitions, didn't create pathways from manual labor to fine art, and Cassius Serre's dreams had curdled into bitterness that he'd drowned in alcohol and expressed in rage at a world that had limited him and a son who'd managed to transcend limitations that had crushed the father. The dynamic had been toxic and tender in turns. Cassius Eastern simultaneously proud of his son's success and resentful of it, celebrating Ali's championships while pointing out that it was his genetics, his athleticism passed down, that had made greatness possible. "You got your speed from me," his father had said 100 times over the years, claiming credit for achievements he'd had no part in earning, needing to believe that his son's success validated his own wasted potential rather than highlighting it. And Ali had let him believe it, had nodded along with the fiction because contradicting his father meant confronting the sad truth that Cassius Serre had been given talent and opportunity and had squandered both through choices that destroyed him slowly over decades. Could you love someone while also knowing they'd failed at almost everything that mattered? Ali looked around the hotel room. Generic and impersonal, the kind of space he'd spent too much of his life in, always traveling, always away from home, always somewhere else when he should have been present. He'd been present for his father in flashes, in moments stolen between training and fights and appearances, had sent money and made phone calls and visited when schedules allowed. But it had never been enough, never filled the gulf that had opened between them when Ali had converted to Islam and changed his name and rejected the identity his father had given him. Cassius Clay was a good enough name for me, his father had said when Ali announced the change, the hurt in his voice unmistakable. This understanding that his son was symbolically killing him by refusing the name they shared. What's wrong with the name your daddy gave you? The name of an abolitionist, a white man who fought for our people. And Ali had tried to explain about slave names and psychological colonization and the need to claim an identity that wasn't gifted by oppressors. But his father had never really understood, had seen it as personal rejection rather than political evolution, had carried that wound for the rest of his life like all the other wounds that drinking couldn't quite numb. How many times had they had that same fight? About the name, about Islam, about Ali's choices that diverged from what his father thought a son should be. Too many to count. And now there would be no more fights, no more chances to find common ground, no more opportunities to bridge the gap that had widened over decades of misunderstanding and miscommunication and mutual stubbornness. His father was gone, taking with him all the potential reconciliations that would now never happen, all the conversations that would remain forever unfinished. Ali picked up the phone finally, called his brother back, and Rahman's voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "He kept asking for you at the end," Rahman said. "Kept saying your name. Not Muhammad. Cassius. He wanted Cassius." The information landed like a punch, this detail that his father's final thoughts had been about his son, about the name he'd given him, about the boy who'd become someone else, and in doing so had somehow betrayed the father who'd dreamed different dreams for him. Ali wanted to ask what else his father had said, whether there'd been any message, any final words meant for him. But the question stuck in his throat because maybe silence was easier than hearing that his father had died disappointed or angry or sad about how things had turned out between them. "I'm flying out tonight," Ali said, his voice rougher than usual. The Parkinson's affecting his speech in ways that made communication difficult, even when emotion wasn't choking him. "I'll be there for the funeral. A was proud of you," Rahman said suddenly, urgently, like he needed Ali to know this, needed to deliver this message before grief swallowed it. He didn't always say it right, didn't always show it right, but he was proud. "Talked about you all the time. Showed your fights to anyone who'd watch. You were his son and he loved you even when he was terrible at showing it." Could that be true? Or was it just the kind thing you tell someone when their father dies and it's too late to fix anything? Ali wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. But decades of experience with his father's complexity made simple narratives feel like lies. His father had been proud and resentful, loving and cruel, supportive and undermining, often in the same conversation, sometimes in the same sentence. Cassius had been a man at war with himself, with his circumstances, with a world that had beaten him down and a son who'd managed to rise above the same forces that had crushed the father. The flight to Louisville was turbulent, matching Ali's internal state, and he spent the hours staring out the window at clouds, thinking about his father's life, trying to find meaning or lesson or some way to process the complicated legacy of a man who'd given him life and then spent that life being both ally and obstacle. His father had been the one who'd introduced him to boxing after 12-year-old Cassius had his bike stolen and had come home crying, wanting revenge on the thief. "You want to fight him?" his father had asked. "Then you better learn how to fight first. Let me take you to a gym." And that decision, that moment of paternal guidance, had set in motion everything that came after: the Olympics, the championships, the fame, the transformation from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, the entire trajectory that had made him the greatest. Without his father's intervention, without being taken to that gym, Ali's life would have been entirely different, unrecognizably different, and he owed his father for that beginning even if the relationship had gotten complicated afterward. What do you owe the person who set you on the path to greatness, even if they resented where that path took you? The funeral home in Louisville was full when Ali arrived, family and friends and people from the neighborhood who'd known Cassius Cern as the sign painter who worked on their businesses, who'd painted murals on their buildings, who'd been part of the community for 50 years despite his demons. Ali's mother was there, divorced from his father for years, but present because death requires certain rituals regardless of how the marriage ended. and she hugged Ali with the fierce grip of someone who'd lost her first love, even if she'd had to leave him to survive. "He was asking for you," she whispered in Ali's ear, confirming what Rahman had said, and Ali nodded against her shoulder. Couldn't speak because emotion had closed his throat and Parkinson's had made speaking difficult anyway. They stood like that for a long moment, mother and son united in grief for a man who'd been impossible to live with, but also impossible not to love in complicated ways. The casket was open, his father's face peaceful in death in a way it rarely had been in life. The rage and bitterness smoothed away, leaving just the features Ali recognized from childhood, from before the drinking got bad, from moments when his father had been present and loving and the man he could have been if circumstances had been different. Ali approached slowly, people parting to let him through, and stood looking down at the body that had housed his father's spirit for 76 years. Cassius Marcellus Clay Sayre was wearing a suit Ali had bought him 3 years ago, had sent for his birthday in one of those gestures that substituted gifts for presents, money for time, things for relationship. The suit looked good on him, better than it had when he'd tried it on and complained that Ali was wasting money on fancy clothes for an old man who had nowhere fancy to go. Now it was his burial suit, the last outfit he'd ever wear, and Ali wondered if his father would appreciate the irony or resent it. Impossible to know with a man whose reactions had always been unpredictable. What do you say to someone who can't hear you anymore? And does it matter if the words are true or just the words you wish had been true? "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Ali whispered, leaning close to the casket, speaking to a man who would never respond, never contradict, never complicate the apology with his own grievances and counter-accusations. "I'm sorry I was in Vegas giving a speech when you needed me. I'm sorry for all the times I chose everything else over being with you. I'm sorry I changed my name and it hurt you. I'm sorry I became someone you didn't always recognize." The words came faster now, years of unsaid things pouring out in the only safe space his father had ever given him. Death, which couldn't argue back or weaponize vulnerability or turn confession into ammunition. "But I'm also not sorry for who I became, for standing up to the draft, for converting to Islam, for being loud and proud and taking up space the world didn't want to give me. You taught me to be strong even when you were weak. You showed me what not to become even when you couldn't become it yourself." Was that fair? Using a funeral for honesty that would have been cruel if delivered to a living man? Probably not. But grief didn't care about fairness, and Ali had spent his whole life performing for audiences, editing himself to be palatable or inspiring or whatever the moment required. And for once he just needed to say true things to the person who'd made him without worrying about how those truths landed or what they cost. "I loved you," Ali said finally. "Even when I didn't like you. Even when you were drunk and mean and disappointing. Even when you resented my success and tried to take credit for things you had no part in. You were my father and I loved you, and I'm sorry we never figured out how to be better to each other." A hand touched his shoulder. His brother, indicating it was time to step back, let other people pay respects, begin the rituals that would carry their father from this room to the ground where his body would return to earth while his spirit went wherever spirits go. Ali nodded, stepped away, found a seat in the back where he could observe without being observed, where his trembling hands and wet eyes wouldn't be photographed and turned into tomorrow's headlines. The service was traditional Baptist. His father had never converted to Islam despite his son's urgings, had stayed committed to the Christianity he'd been raised with, and Ali respected that even though it meant the funeral would be conducted in a religious framework he'd left behind. The preacher talked about Cassius Sayre's art, about the murals that still decorated Louisville buildings, about the talent that had touched the community even if it never achieved the recognition it deserved. He was a man of great gifts, the preacher said, who lived in a time and place that didn't always recognize those gifts. But he gave them anyway, shared them with his community, left beauty in his wake even when the world told him his beauty didn't matter. Was that true, or just the kind thing you say about dead people to make their lives seem more meaningful than they felt while living them? Ali didn't know. His father's art had been real. The murals were still there, people still admired them, and there was something touching about the idea that his father's work would outlive him, would keep bringing color and life to Louisville streets long after the hand that painted them had stilled. Maybe that was enough. Maybe you didn't need gallery shows and critical acclaim to matter. Maybe touching your immediate community with beauty was its own form of success, even if the wider world never noticed. The preacher moved on to Cassius Sar's family, talking about his sons, especially the famous one, and Ali tensed waiting for the usual framing. Great father who'd produced a great son, talent passed down through bloodlines, pride in offspring accomplishment. But the preacher surprised him, went a different direction. Cassius Sester and his son Muhammad didn't always see eye to eye. The preacher said carefully. They had their struggles, their disagreements, their times of distance. But that's what family is. People who love each other even through conflict, who stay connected even when connection is hard, who keep trying to understand each other even when understanding seems impossible. Cassius Ser loved his sons. They loved him. And that love was complicated and real and human in all the ways love actually is. The honesty was unexpected and appreciated. This acknowledgement that their relationship had been messy, that grief didn't require pretending everything had been perfect, that you could mourn complicated people without simplifying them into easy narratives. Ali felt something release in his chest, some permission to hold both the love and the resentment, the gratitude and the anger, the mourning and the relief. At the burial, standing beside the grave watching his father's casket lowered into Kentucky ground, Ali thought about legacy and what gets passed from parents to children beyond genetics and last names. His father had given him athleticism and charisma and artistic sensitivity, but he'd also given him lessons in what not to become, how not to handle disappointment, how not to deal with unfulfilled dreams, how not to let bitterness poison everything you touch. Were those negative lessons less valuable than positive ones? And could you be grateful for what you learned about who not to be? Ali's mother stood beside him, and she took his shaking hand in hers, held it steady while dirt was shoveled onto the casket, earth covering the box that held the body that had held the man who'd named him Cassius and expected him to stay Cassius and never quite forgave him for becoming Muhammad. The name difference was everything and nothing. His father in the ground was still his father, whether you called him Cassius Sarther, or addressed him by first name or never spoke of him again. Back at the family house after the burial, relatives and friends gathered to eat and reminisce and tell stories about Cassius Ster that ranged from funny to tragic, painting a portrait of a man larger and more complicated than any single narrative could capture. Ali's uncle told about the time Cassius Sester had painted a mural so beautiful that the building owner had cried seeing it, had said it was the finest art he'd ever seen, and he'd seen art in New York galleries that couldn't touch what this Louisville sign painter had created. "Your daddy had a gift," the uncle said directly to Ali. "Real gift. World just didn't give him space to use it fully. But he used what space he got, and that counts for something. Did it? Did using partial space for partial gifts count as success, or just highlight the tragedy of potential unrealized?" Ali's cousin told a darker story about finding Cassius Ser passed out drunk in an alley behind his paint shop, about having to clean him up and get him home before anyone saw, about the pattern of drinking that had stolen decades from a man who could have been so much more if he'd been able to stop poisoning himself with alcohol and rage. "He was hard to love sometimes," the cousin said bluntly, "but we loved him anyway. That's what family does." The afternoon stretched into evening, stories piling on stories, and a picture emerged of a man who'd been talented and troubled, loving and cruel, proud and bitter, all of it true simultaneously, none of it canceling out the rest. Ali listened mostly, his voice too affected by Parkinson's to contribute much, and people understood. Gave him space to grieve quietly while they processed their own relationships with the deceased. As guests started leaving, Ali's mother pulled him aside, led him to his father's old paint shop that was attached to the house, a space Ali hadn't been in for years. It smelled like it always had. Turpentine and oil paint, and the particular mustiness of a room that didn't get cleaned as often as it should. His father's paintings and murals in various stages of completion lined the walls, and his mother flicked on lights revealing a lifetime of work that most people would never see. "He painted one for you," she said, walking to an easel in the corner that held a canvas covered with a sheet. "Been working on it for 2 years. Wanted it to be perfect before he showed you. Said it was his masterpiece." She pulled the sheet away and Ali saw himself, rendered in oils, but not the Ali the world knew. Not the greatest in boxing pose or Olympic glory or any of the public images his father could have chosen. Instead, it was 12-year-old Cassius, the day they'd gone to the gym for the first time, skinny and uncertain, and looking up at his father with complete trust, and standing beside him was Cassius Cern, hand on his son's shoulder, smiling down with pride that was pure and uncomplicated. How long had that moment of pure pride lasted before resentment crept in to complicate it? "He said this was you before everything changed," Ali's mother explained, tears streaming down her face. "Before the fighting and the fame and the name change and all the things that came between you." Just his boy, looking at him like he had all the answers. He wanted to remember that moment. Wanted you to remember it too. Ali stood staring at the painting, his father's final message rendered in brushstrokes and color, and understood that this was the apology Cassius Cern couldn't make with words. The acknowledgement that somewhere things had gone wrong between them, but there'd been a time before that wrongness, a moment of pure father-son connection that deserved to be preserved and honored. The technical skill in the painting was remarkable. His father really had been talented, really could have been a significant artist if the world had made space for it. The figures were perfectly proportioned. The emotion captured in their faces was genuine and moving. The composition was sophisticated in ways that belied the sign painter label his father had been stuck with. This wasn't commercial work or hack painting. This was real art created by someone with serious gifts. What would his father's life have been if he'd been born in a different time, a different place with different opportunities? Impossible to know. You could only live the life you got, navigate the circumstances you were born into, make choices within the constraints that existed. Cassius Cern had been born a black man in Kentucky in the 1910s, had come of age during Depression and Jim Crow, had found what success he could in a world designed to limit him, and had drowned his disappointment in alcohol because the gap between what he could have been and what he was allowed to be had become unbearable. And he'd passed that gift and that burden to his son. The athletic talent, the artistic sensitivity, the charisma, but also the understanding of what it meant to have potential in a world that didn't want you to fulfill it. The difference was that Ali had been born a generation later, had come of age when civil rights was opening doors Cassius Cern had found locked, had found ways to transcend limitations that had crushed his father. Was that why his father had resented his success? Not because he wasn't proud, but because it highlighted how arbitrary and cruel the limits on his own life had been. "He wanted you to have it," Ali's mother said, indicating the painting. "Wanted you to take it with you, hang it somewhere you'd see it every day. Said it was important that you remember where you came from, who gave you your start, that the you the world knows came from this." She gestured at the painting. "From this moment when you were just his boy and he was just your daddy." Ali nodded, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at this image his father had labored over for 2 years, this gift that was also a plea to be remembered not as the drunk or the bitter, resentful man he'd become, but as the father who'd taken his crying son to a boxing gym and changed both their lives forever. "I'll keep it," Ali managed to say, voice barely above a whisper. "I'll treasure it. I'll make sure people know he created it." And he did. The painting went with him when he left Louisville, got hung in his home office where he could see it every day. And when people asked about it, he'd tell them about his father, about the talent that never got full recognition, about the complicated love between a man who resented his son's success and the son who'd achieved what his father couldn't. Years later, when Parkinson's had progressed to the point where Ali could barely function, when most days were a struggle to do basic tasks and communication was nearly impossible, he'd sit in his office staring at that painting, at 12-year-old him looking at his father with uncomplicated trust, and try to remember what that trust had felt like before life made it complicated. His father had been gone for years by then, buried in Louisville beside other family members who'd lived and died and left whatever legacy people leave when they're mostly ordinary with flashes of extraordinary. But the painting remained, Cassius-Ser's final message rendered permanent in oils, and Ali would look at it and think about fathers and sons and the ways love gets tangled up with disappointment and resentment and pride. Would they have eventually reconciled if his father had lived longer, or was the divide too fundamental to bridge? Ali would never know. His father had died with things unsaid between them, with grievances unaired and forgiveness never explicitly granted, and that incompleteness would be something Ali carried into his own death. One more weight added to all the other weights that fame and fighting and Parkinson's had piled on. But he had the painting. He had the memory of that moment before everything got complicated. He had the understanding that his father had loved him, even when unable to show it properly, had been proud, even when resentment poisoned the pride, had recognized that what he'd started in that gym had grown into something far beyond what either of them could have imagined. And maybe that was enough. Maybe you didn't need perfect relationships or clean resolutions or Hollywood endings. Maybe you just needed to know that the person who gave you life had loved you imperfectly, had done their best with the tools they had left you something. A painting, a lesson, a name, a gift. That survived them and connected you across the barrier death created. The telegram that had brought news of his father's death was long gone, discarded in some hotel trash can in some city Ali couldn't remember. But its message remained. Those 12 words that had marked the end of one relationship and the beginning of a different one. No longer with his living father, but with his father's memory, with the legacy both complicated and clear that Cassius-Star had left behind. Die better than you lived. Ali had told that to others, to the racist, to people struggling with addiction, to anyone facing their mortality with regrets about how they'd spent their time. Had his father died better than he'd lived? Had the final 2 years spent creating a masterpiece for his son redeemed the decades of drinking and bitterness? Maybe. Or maybe redemption wasn't the right framework. Maybe people were just complicated, containing multitudes of good and bad, love and rage, talent and waste, and you mourned the whole person, not just the parts that were easy to mourn. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jenner, named for his father and for a white abolitionist, who'd rejected both names in favor of one he'd chosen himself, looked at the painting of a boy who trusted his father completely and knew that somewhere between that moment and this one, trust had become complicated but love had survived. And that survival, imperfect and messy and real, was the legacy that mattered. Not the championships or the fame or the name carved on tombstones, but the stubborn persistence of love even through conflict, even through resentment, even through all the ways fathers and sons fail each other while trying to be what the other needs. His father was gone. The painting remained. And Ali, trembling hands and failing voice and all the limitations that Parkinson's imposed, would spend whatever time he had left looking at that image of who they'd both been before everything got complicated, remembering that moment of pure connection before the world demanded they become more and different and irreconcilable. It was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, impossibly it was,